Okay, so welcome, Caleb. And I have a little bit of an intro to share with you about Caleb, and then we'll turn it over to him. So he's waving. So Caleb was the lead digital strategist for Obama's political advocacy group called OFA during Obama's second term. And he grew one of the largest digital programs in existence, 1 million email subscribers and largest Twitter account in the world at the time. I'm not sure, Caleb, if that's been beat or not, but you can share with everybody in a minute. Very impressive.
Still number one.
Okay, still number one. There we go. So he's worked at Edelman, and we met when he was at Bain here in Chicago at an executives club meeting here, and hit it off and pretty much talked that whole night and caught up on lots of similar values and things that we believe about the world. He's now running 18 Coffees, a management consulting firm here in Chicago, and they have a quest to help their partnering clients to have more ethical and inclusive practices in what they do. And he just wrote and released No Point B, a rule book for leading change in the new hyper-connected, radically conscious economy. And I'm sure he's going to mention a little bit more about that here today. And he's here to share 5 digital trends about his POV on the future of education. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So think about your questions, and I'm happy to facilitate those questions through the chat, whatever you share in the chat, and also open it up to verbal questions as well. So whatever your preference is. So over to you, Caleb.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead, Aaron, and just share my screen and
Great.
Share the presentation old school. Part of what I was technically trying to do that we were waiting on was get my iPad to be recognized by my computer in order to share from there, which is what I usually like to do, because then I can mark up my screen. But we're going to roll with it. And I feel like part of what we learned about digital trends is that tech breaks sometimes and you got to adjust, which I'm sure has happened to all of us. So, all right. Share my screen. You see that for me? Just nod.
Yep, looks good.
Everyone see it? Great. So I'll give a quick intro to myself, because I do feel like part of how I view the world is really informed by my background, which Aaron, very graciously gave you a top line of. But I worked for this guy for almost 4 years. And I was running digital strategy in the private sector before this, but really a formative experience in terms of especially seeing how digital can be used for good and I think for evil, and really seeing how the tech industry can either help enable that or help not enable it, depending on what systems they give us to engage with in society. So that I really come at it from a much more practical, I think I would call myself pragmatically optimistic now. Whereas before I might have been just straight up optimistic. And then, there were a few years, maybe in like 2016, 2017, when I was just straight pessimistic. So maybe I'm coming back out of that a little bit. And now I'm a little bit more practical. But now, as Aaron mentioned, I run a firm called 18 Coffees, and we really like to think of the work that we do at the intersection of these 3 major trends. Digital disruption. We come from digital innovation backgrounds. We think about the impact of technology on business, especially, but also just on larger society all the time. And especially from the very beginning, Aaron knows this, when we met, we were thinking about what's the impact for how, when we've got these massive supercomputers we're carrying around in our pockets every day, what does that mean for how it changes society? We were very interested in the intersection between digital disruption and social change from the beginning, and how we have to adjust our working models to understand that as well. And I think business leaders now are starting to think about how they adjust their mental models to understand that we don't just sit here on Teams doing our work every day. We sit here on Teams or Slack or whatever it is, and then up here we have Twitter or TikTok or whatever cultural thing is also trying to persuade us and teach us things about the world. And so those things are very much intersecting, and we like to think about that from a future of work perspective, which just means how should that change how we think about leadership, how we organize our teams, how we think about virtual teams versus in-person teams. Like all of that is on the table for how we are thinking about this. And Aaron mentioned that I just wrote a book called No Point B. So this is my selfish plug for that. It is really, me trying to think about all that work we've done at 18 Copies over the years and things that I've learned throughout my career, and trying to, from a high level, say, what does this mean for how we need to be change leaders now? And what does it mean to have best practices, for how we can be change leaders? And so I won't talk about it much more than that, but, go ahead and pick it up at any bookstore, books were sold, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a great read, you guys. I read it a few weeks ago. It's awesome. So
thank
there's
you.
your plug too there, Caleb.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. So I like to start, before I want to talk about the trends, I want to talk about a couple of core principles that inform how I view even looking at trends, looking like forecasting, like we're going to try to do together. One is that we underestimate the pace of change at our own peril. Everything is changing all the time underneath our feet. That's the old adage, like change is the status quo. I think, before the pandemic, we all might have rolled our eyes at that. And then in 2020, when I was writing this book, I was like, oh my God, like this is very applicable. I hope it's still applicable in 2 years, and comes out in 2022 and it's still very applicable, right? Like we always, like, what's the classic example of this is like the Blockbuster Netflix thing, where if you actually look at Netflix's market adoption versus Blockbuster, it just like runs underneath it for a really long time, and then all of a sudden goes shoom, and Blockbuster goes shoom. Like it's that kind of disruptive things that are happening underneath our feet that we underestimate, like because we don't feel them. We also underestimate, the impact of carrying around our phones every day and being connected to the world's brokenness on our mental health. And we underestimate, the dissonance we're feeling between what is coming and what is here, and and what we actually are prepared mentally to wrap our heads around. Like I don't think many of us step back on a day-to-day basis and think about this social dissonance we're feeling, but it is there, and it's affecting how we think about work, affecting our ability to learn based on this conversation. And it's something that we have to, keep in mind. I brought in this image from the Tesla presentation that was given, I think it was 2 months ago, where they brought out a model of this AI robot that they are starting to develop. Did anybody catch this when it came out? A lot of it is just marketing BS, and, who knows when they'll actually bring it to market, but they're using some of their AI that they developed in their driverless cars to now put it in these actual, like, humanoid looking, kind of creepy, to be honest, things that are supposed to help you out around the house. And, we kind of laugh and roll our eyes, but in truth, like, we've got many versions of this. I've got a Roomba upstairs that cleans our floor. Like, it's not out of the question to think that this is going to come sooner than we expect, right? So again, things are changing all around us, and most of us and most of my clients are kind of reacting like this, which is fine. And it's a really uncomfortable place to be, but it doesn't have to be. And this is my other core principle, is that change means opportunity. Like we can reframe it for ourselves and look at what's the good and bad of this situation. And I think when we look at all the trends we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you my honest perspective about what I see being good about it and what I see potentially being a negative. And that future could be either. And that's kind of one of the core principles of how we look at change, is that it doesn't have to be negative, it doesn't have to be positive, but if we don't engage, it's more likely to be negative, right? Like we have agency over the kind of future that we want to build. And, one personal example I like to give about this is that my son just turned 13 this year and got his first full smartphone. We resisted it a very long time, but he was one of the last ones in his grade when he turned 13 to actually have a phone. So his peers had it for a really long time. And we were really nervous. We gave him the whole speech about, like, if you want to join a social media account, you got to talk to us about it first. Like if you want to message people, like strangers on the internet, YouTube videos, we went over the whole thing. You know, I'm super paranoid about it, you know, having come from, you know, what I've come from. Turns out he wasn't really that interested in that. And it's been a real bonding experience for us. Like I take business trips now and text him and like talk to him when he, you know, is back at home. And I send him really dumb dad jokes that he then gets really upset at me about. But, you know, it's been something that we can actually bond over. So in that experience, in that fear of change, we managed around it, but it turns out that there was actually an opportunity there to create a deeper relationship. And so it's been really fun. So those are two things that I want you to keep in mind as we start talking about these trends. One, and I'm just going to go through all of these, and then I feel like we can talk about them at the end, but these are just things that I'm seeing from my perspective in innovation fields. This one actually, though, is from my experience in publishing, having just published this book. By the way, the publishing industry, I'm looking over my shoulder, by the way, it's right over there. I'm like, oh, that book. The publishing industry is wild. Like it is, I can't think of an industry that has been both more disrupted, but is still so old school in so many ways, in terms of its time to market, in terms of its relation, like it's still being very relational driven, in terms of how many market decisions are still based on like a publisher's gut instinct or an editor's gut instinct about their read on the market. In terms of the old school dynamics between traditional publishing and like self-publishing. But it's this publishing gap is what I'm calling it, which is basically what do we know about the world and when do things actually get formalized and published is starting to close. And this is one of the reasons I resisted anything in academia for a long time, because I would talk to my friends at Northwestern or University of Chicago or whatever it was, and they'd be like, oh, we would love to have you come teach on this topic in 2 years in spring of 2024. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to know about that topic in 2 years. Like, are you kidding me? But that gap is starting to close both in higher ed. It's starting to close in the publishing industry. Even my book, like having been delivered to my publisher and then gotten to market like 7 months later, that was a really short timeline for the publishing industry. It's also starting to close because there's starting to become market pressure with different kinds of learning. Like there's obviously ebooks that have been around for a long time. There's courses, there's ways that we can formalize and teach people outside of traditional publishing, outside of traditional academia, that's creating pressure on those industries that were supposed to be the kind of bulwark of quality to go a lot faster. It took a really long time for this to happen. And I still think it's moving, in my opinion, slower than it should. But I think the pandemic has escalated it and made it, you know, move even faster, because it actually removed some of the even more entrenched traditional things that went along with publishing a book that people realized didn't have value, and they started focusing on the things that actually have value. Anyway, fascinating. Happy to talk to you about what my experience in actual book publishing was like, because it was wild. But the other thing, trend number 2, that I think is going to make this publishing and generally being an academic expert on something harder is that identity and authority are starting to become eroded. And I will give you examples of what I mean by this. The first of which is on this screen. Does anyone recognize any of these faces from a couple of years ago when they became famous? That's because they became famous from a website called, let me see if I'm gonna butcher this. I think it's called These Are Not Real People. You remember this? It was literally just AI generated faces. So none of these people actually exist. And this freaked out everyone when it came out, for good reason, because these people look like they exist. Like it's really good, right? But what's happening now is that through this year, especially generative AI like this, where you can learn a lot about what faces look like, or you know, how people talk, etc., is starting to really take off in terms of how art is created, in terms of how things are written. Like it's starting to become something that people in creative industries are taking and running with. And the problem with it is that it's all based on how the AI learns from what other people have actually done. So you could become a brilliant artist by going on, what's one of the, like, God, all the names are eluding me right now. Stable Diffusion is one. You go on Stable Diffusion and say, give me artwork that looks like this other famous artist, and it will create iterations of something that looks like their art that learned from them, but it's actually not them at all. And people are doing this, and artists are getting upset about it, understandably. It's getting much better about learning language. It's getting much better about basically any of those creative fields, learning from them and taking it and running with it and doing other things with it. And malicious actors are starting to do this by taking these people and making Instagram profiles of them, making, all kinds of different fake profiles, fake text messages, fake, like there's so much out there now being created by people who don't actually exist. Sometimes it's for malicious ends, sometimes it's for humorous ends, but this is part of how identity and authority are eroding. That's one example, the AI problem. The other example is we still have not solved how to actually demonstrate authority on normal Web 2.0 social media. We right now have the world's richest man just acquired one of the more democratic tools for organizing people, Twitter. And what is the first thing he wants to do? Make verification something that doesn't actually go through a process. It's just something anyone can pay for. And my friend Dave said, this is great. I'm going to pay $8 for a Twitter check mark, and then I'm going to make Tom Hanks say ridiculous things online. And who's going to know whether or not it's Tom Hanks, beloved actor, or me? No one will know. And I was like, God, it's just like messes with my mind. So we are on the path toward understanding who people are, why they're an actual authority on a subject. We're on a very dark path, I think, right now. There are actually, to go back to looking at change as an opportunity, I think interesting ways that identity is going to be changed by things like Web3 technology, where we can actually have more authority and data points around who someone is based on, if you look at things like Jack Dorsey's Web5 project, which I really hate, he's basically hate the name, not the project. He's basically trying to take how people decide who owns a Bitcoin, for example, like the technology behind that, and make it more of your social identity around a social profile. So people can build on that, and it can be a more authoritative identifier. I think there's interesting things happening with that technology, but we're so far away from that being in widespread usage that we're in this annoying, possibly, destructive time where identity is actually eroding, not being built. Does that make sense? I think I bring this to a conversation about learning, because if we're going to talk about being an authority on something, you have to actually be able to build authority and identity around that subject. And I think that's getting harder. All right, trend 3. This one should be obvious, but I want to talk about some of the ways that I'm seeing it happen. Is that virtual learning is learning from how virtual work works. And yes, I made that a tongue twister for myself on purpose because I thought it was fun. But there was a time, and I'm gonna speak broadly here, where a lot of the virtual learning things that were happening were much more innovative than what was happening in work. Like we created massive online learning courses from universities. There was a lot more experimentation about how do we learn well from, especially when we're not geographically connected, or we can't be on site at a corporation or on site at the university or whatever the context might be. But what happened in 2020 is, I think the roles kind of reversed, because all of a sudden work was like, oh crap, we've got to figure out how this work environment is actually going to function. And because a lot of money got put into the technology around virtual work in those first few years of the pandemic, I mean, how many of you saw an explosion in startups going, oh, we can do virtual meetings better than Zoom. We can do it this way. We can have parties. We can have that. Like, our company actually tried a ton of, event-based things that were try to like replace offline events with fun games. We tried different supplemental software to a normal kind of virtual meeting like this, where you could do whiteboards or you could do sticky notes or whatever. Like there was just an explosion of, if not innovation, because some of it was basically just trying to recreate what you could do offline, at least interesting ideas, much more so than, our WebEx Zoom driven future of pre-pandemic, which was basically all virtual work was. So now I think the pendulum swung a little bit because of all that investment in how you do virtual work. And I think there are actually really interesting things that a virtual learning environment can learn about how we do virtual work well, in terms of supplementing. I think for a long time, I was actually giving a presentation to a client about this yesterday. I think for a long time, we just assumed that the best practices for giving a presentation or any kind of really like learning online was basically just trying to do what you did offline well. And I think those of us who have done this enough have learned that there are actually lots of really interesting things and pretty low lift things you can do to supplement the learning experience from offline or from lost my train of thought. You can supplement the online learning experience with tools that you can't use offline. So you can have a separate chat going while someone's giving a presentation. Couldn't do that in person, that would be rude. You can have people engaging in different ways, or like engaging with the content. You can engage with different kind of learners, kinesthetic learners or reading and writing learners at the same time as you're giving the oral and visual presentation. There's easier ways to engage all kind of learners at once. But I think all this is being built on the very real need to engage that remote workforce. Make sense? Okay, trend number 4. I always like to start these with things like start the trends with things that we basically see coming very soon or maybe happening now, and then slowly like zoom out to what is going to happen over the next 10 years, 15 years. Like, let's start forecasting down the road a little bit. And one of the things that is slowly happening that we don't even realize is more of the world is coming online. And what I mean by this is I think we underestimate on any given day how little of the world is actually online. Like, the last Pew Internet research I saw about how much of the global community was actually connected to the internet was only 51%. Like, half of the world is actually online. Isn't that wild? What is going to be the effect of the rest of the world bringing their values and their culture and the things they've learned from their culture to engage with the rest of the world slowly but surely? What infrastructure are we going to use to engage with those folks? What new areas of value is that going to create for business that is going to change, the global economic dynamic? I think this is something that I think about a ton as someone who does, quite a bit of global work. Just thinking about what markets are going to happen for our clients that don't exist right now. I also think about it a lot in the context of some of the world was brought online by private companies like Facebook, and that is their experience of the world, and how much that gives me pause. But even zooming in a little bit into the United States, we've got somewhere around 90% market penetration in terms of online connectivity here, but it's not equal. We've got much higher broadband speeds in cities, for example, than we do in rural communities, if rural communities have broadband at all. There have been stories over the last few years, especially as we were getting into remote education because we couldn't go into school in person, about kids having to drive down to their local McDonald's to get Wi-Fi in order to go to school, and how much of a barrier to entry that was to learning. So we are still in the middle of building infrastructure in our own country to be able to allow people an equal access to economic opportunity and equal access to learning. So even if we zoom into just that, what is that? How is that going to change our internet dynamic in this country? It's fascinating to think about. I think that could be, I've got friends that have worked on that on the Hill. I've got a friend who wrote tech policy for Nancy Pelosi. And when she was trying to, have resources pointed in that direction in terms of infrastructure in this country, I think the pandemic really, again, shined a light on how bad that digital divide actually was. But a lot of resources got plugged into that. And I think it's really going to change our internet experience here in the US. All right, last one. And I hate to bring this up because I make fun of it all the time, but it actually is going to be transformative eventually. So we can't talk about learning in a digital world without talking about the metaverse. And I will try to define this a little bit for those of you who are uninitiated. God bless you for being uninitiated to this, because I've probably read way too much about it. But basically the concept of the metaverse is the world is moving in a way that will be more augmented in terms of the information around us that we will be able to interact with, and more virtual and immersive in terms of our work and lives when we're at home. So this is why, you get these ridiculous, silly images of people in VR when you're talking about the metaverse. Metaverse is not the same thing as the VR, but VR is essential to the experience. So one of the reasons why I make fun of the metaverse quite a bit, not just because it's like Mark Zuckerberg's baby and I like making fun of Mark Zuckerberg, but it's because the applications for the metaverse right now in its existing technology are pretty limited. There's not a lot of things where I would be like, yes, I would rather do that in the metaverse than I would in my normal work environment or in my normal home life or there's very few things where I'm like, oh, I wish I could do this in VR, right? Gaming is one of them. Gaming is actually having some serious investment and some serious, really fun experiences that people are building in a virtual environment. It makes sense if you think about the trajectory of gaming to date, right? We've been talking to each other, we've been engaging with each other. Now we're just doing it in a more immersive environment. Learning is one of the other immediate opportunities that I see in terms of the metaverse. And it may be one of the ones that has the most interesting applications right now. And that is that if you think about it from a corporate training perspective. So that one particular type of learning. In a distributed world where you never actually see each other, let's say we've got a complete remote work environment, on-the-job training basically doesn't exist, right? On-the-job training is you in your 2D Brady Bunch Zoom world teaching me how to do my job, but we're not actually doing it together. So again, if you think about kinesthetic learners or other types of learners that don't really learn well if they're not doing it, the metaverse being a more immersive experience is actually really great for them. On top of the fact that there's some things where, if you're an industrial designer, how do you learn on the job in a distributed world and be an industrial designer where you have to be hands-on with the product? If you think about the combination of things like that and the eventual evolution of 3D printing, it gets really interesting to think about what the world could look like in just a few years. So that's corporate training on top of just thinking about all the other applications of it, right? In terms of what it could mean for higher ed, in terms of what it can mean for K through 12, in terms of what it could mean for just workshopping or other types of learning. I think it could get especially as the avatars get better. Right now, they are still super creepy. And Mark Zuckerberg came out with one that has been very much made fun of this year. And then Facebook immediately tried to make it better. But I've seen some technology, you can go out and see videos of companies that are specifically working on the ability to read your face and your facial expressions and what your face looks like and create immediate digital avatars of your actual face. It's wild. So when the technology catches up and you can start reading people's social cues and reading people's emotions in those virtual environments, that's going to be a game changer. When the digital infrastructure we were just talking about catches up and people have better internet connectivity and faster internet connectivity, that's going to be a game changer. When the hardware costs come down and you can actually start affording something that right now, like a Quest 2 in Facebook's metaverse world, costs like $2,000. Like, it's insane, but those costs will eventually come down. So eventually the applications of this are going to be really interesting. That's the virtual learning world. We're not even talking about the augmented learning capabilities of being able to walk into a historic building and immediately, like you're doing an audio tour, maybe you get like augmented information or augmented video in some kind of feed that actually teaches you about that environment in a really immersive way. Like there's the applications of this are really interesting, I think, for this. But one of the reasons why I left it on the back is we are still many, many years away from that being our actual everyday experience. I think that unlike what Mark Zuckerberg being bullish on it, I think it's going to come a lot farther along than he actually wants it to. But I do think that is the future that we are looking at. I just think it's going to be a future that doesn't require us looking kind of like this dude, where we look ridiculous when we're actually doing it. Like there's a social cost to us looking like this out in public that it has to be considered. Okay, that's my 5 trends. I always like to end with, again, talking about the kind of change we want to see and looking at change as an opportunity. You know, what kind of disruption do we actually want to the learning environment? Like, I think that we have agency to be able to craft the kind of future that we want to see, and we all have to be a part of making that future happen. And now I will stop talking to you and let's actually have a discussion about this, and let me hear questions from you.
Thanks, Caleb. That was amazing. Really rich 5 points there. And I'm very confident that with this group, the Q&A will be also quite rich. Yeah, lots of questions about AI and the future of learning and education. And of course, what you mentioned around corporate training as it relates to the metaverse. I'll throw one more thing on top of that too, in terms of thinking about things like Khan World School right now, which is essentially a independent school that is looking at, virtual high school, and then bringing in international students as well as US students to do their high school online in partnership with ASU Prep. So that in and of itself is really innovative and progressive for most families in the United States and perhaps internationally. And then overlay that concept with metaverse thinking and Web3, Ed3 stuff. Like, how do you see that in the next decade? And somebody like Sal Khan, what do you think his vision might be as it relates to the short-term innovation of online high school meets all of this progression and innovation that you're talking about the last 5-10 minutes?
Well, the immediate thing it makes me think of is I don't want it to end up creating even more of a digital divide between the haves and have-nots. Like, I think that there's a real opportunity in the charter school debate, for example, about how we fund schools for those who can afford it versus everyone else, where we create these really awesome, immersive, technologically enabled experiences, but it's only actually for the wealthiest families or the wealthiest children. And so we, again, create more of a divide between those who can access that kind of education and those who can't. And I speak to this having a wife who is a teacher and, constantly has to fight for every resource that she gets. So I don't know. I think that makes me nervous from that point of view, but from just a straight innovation point of view and like what I want from our children in the future, my children in particular, I think that'd be awesome. I think it sounds, I'm imagining a day. I said this in a presentation a few weeks ago to a bunch of salespeople, and they were like, what? I'm imagining a day when you want to have an experience where you're like, my kids just learned about Egypt, for example, and they're like, looking at a textbook and pictures, but there's going to be a day where they're just like, okay, let's go to Egypt. And they put on their equipment and they're literally walking through the pyramids. Like, I think that's amazing. And I'm jealous. I would want that. But when is that day going to come? Who knows?
Yeah, that bridges to a question Libby has here around, is there anybody you would point to that's already doing some interesting work in K-12 and in terms of metaverse and those kinds of tools, perhaps?
Not that I've seen, but I'm also not close enough to K-12. Literally, my own experience is colored by what my wife is doing and what my wife's school is doing. And they're even a more wealthy and privileged school, I think, than most of the United States. And I would say that their tech is still very behind. I think the most innovative thing they've done I've seen in the last 5 years is make the use of Google Classroom pretty ubiquitous. And I have my own complaints as a parent who has to monitor homework on Google Classroom with that experience. It's not great. It's okay for what it is. So there's still a long way to go. I think there is the opportunity, I think, just from a supplementary, outside of the classroom experience itself, there is the opportunity just from a supplementary standpoint to bring in a lot more interesting outside teachers, a lot more interesting outside speakers and stuff like that to the school experience itself through things like virtual environments. I think that'd be interesting to keep an eye on, but I think we've got a long way to go to get over the budgeting gaps and the entrenchment of how, we've just got, even again at my wife's school, there's been people that have been teaching there for 20, 25 years and don't really want to do anything different. There's a generational gap. There's a lot of hurdles to get over.
Yeah. Christian, I'll hold up one of your questions around privacy, really, and safety online and some of the things there, and I'll pass it over to you also to voice it. So feel free to fill in those gaps. But just what degree do you feel like this sort of camera-based monitoring as it relates to some of this tracking and real life stuff based on all your corporate work? How does that apply to education in general?
Oh, I've got so many feelings about this. I mean, again, I've come at this both from the corporate side, but also from a parent who had to help manage my kids being online remote learning during the pandemic, and teachers having a lot of different thoughts about whether or not the kids had to have their camera on or not. I don't see the same kind of real sophisticated tracking in K through 12 yet. It's more of a or even in the college world where I've taught a little bit and I have friends that are professors, it's usually just a preference of the person themselves about whether or not they force people who are on the call to be on camera or not. In that environment, I've got mixed feelings about being on camera because one, not being on camera myself, but forcing people to be on camera, because I think it creates a little bit of a divide between, if it's a really personal kind of invasion of someone's space to make you show them not only your face, but where you live and what your background is. And in our educational system, we have a lot of people who come from a lot of different wealth backgrounds, a lot of different family backgrounds. And so to force people to be on camera when they're in that personal environment is a lot more invasive, I think, than a lot of teachers realize, or a lot of professors realize. So that's kind of how I think about it there. From a corporate monitoring and surveillance standpoint, I find it to be counterintuitive. I just think that there are literally TikToks you can watch today that will teach you how to beat the surveillance system of your company. You can go and search and they're oh, just make sure to move your mouse every 10 minutes. It's one, completely easy to get around if you really want to, quiet quit even when you're being online surveilled. And two, it just creates an environment of distrust between the companies and the people that are working there. It's to me, it is, from just a practical best business standpoint, it's not helpful in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree with you there. Yeah. Forgive me if I've missed anyone's big points in the chat, but I'd love to open it up just for some verbal questions. This, again, is just such a profoundly awesome group of individuals. I'd love to hear some additional folks speak into the questions.
Aaron, do you mind if Caleb, I'd love
Please
to,
jump in, Christian.
I put a bunch there, but I think where my curiosity lies, Caleb, after listening to you and reading some of the others is, I think in some respects, we as human beings are enamored with like the interface, like the iPhone 3, 12, 73, whatever. And the real thing is like at a certain point in time, the interfaces are going to disappear. Like it's just inevitable that we won't be going to an object called laptop or an object called, headset. Like at some point in time, the data will simply be whether it's embedded in a contact lens or it's just kind of hovers or whatever. So in some respects, I'm wondering about the difference between the short term, like Zoom is a hyper short term reality. Like we're all overnight becoming both enamored and frustrated with this interface. But at some point in time, it's not going to be about Zoom, but we're setting up a lot of cultural policy, emotional reactions to it in the short term that are suggestive that a generation from now, if we get it right, will be better. When the real truth is what's coming is going to be just, it's not even going to take seriously our fervor. And I guess one of the things that I was just looking at this book recently had read, and to me, when I read that with a bunch of leaders of organizations, and I think about
back here.
university presidents and others, is like we spend a lot of time worrying about, is Facebook dismantling our politics, or is Instagram or TikTok making our kids distracted, when really at the end of the day, the tech companies and those who can really see what's coming over the horizon couldn't care less what platform you're on, or couldn't care less whether or not you click the link. Like at the end of the day, we are playing a really one or two dimensional, short-term, emotional, like hive mind, but the things coming around the pike are so sophisticated, so exponential, so beyond, that I'm just wondering, because you have sat in international policy conversations, you've been with coders, you think as a keynote speaker, what should we really be talking about as opposed to what is in the short term accessible?
I love that that's where you got to, is just what should we be talking about? I mean,
I don't mean your trends aren't what we should be talking about, but if we could fully embrace what you've just pointed out, what would be the thing that we would really be purposefully wrestling with?
But I think the tough thing about answering that question, the reason why so many people struggle with it, is we have to hold intention immediately what is in front of us and why it is important with possible futures. Because I think where tech leaders, for example, get lost is they say, the metaverse is coming, that's what we've got to focus on. Or this thing is coming, it doesn't matter what we're doing, we got to focus on this thing. When in fact, we live in a world of multiple possible futures. And so we have to be able to look across multiple horizons at once. I believe that the midterms happening next week are of utmost importance, but that is urgently right in front of me. And it can also be true that democracy is in peril and we've got to focus on long-term infrastructure, and we've got to focus on, do you know what I mean? Like, I think we have to hold in tension the things that are immediately present and immediately threatening, and oftentimes, speaking of the midterms, and what the possible futures actually can be. And it's a false binary to look at both of those. I think there are things that are likely in the future that it is good to plan for. But when we talk about like investments, for example, with our clients, we usually talk about it in terms of a like 70-20-10 model of like 70% of your resources, your time, your money, go to the things that you know are actually working, or maybe there you can go to defensive things where you know you've got to catch up. And to your point about figuring out how people are going to work in a remote environment with Zoom, maybe we haven't figured that out yet, and we really need to figure it out because it's becoming a drag on our productivity. But then 20% of that needs to be on what's next, like the next 2-3 years. We see things around the corner. We know that this thing is going to change. We need to make investments in the things that we know are coming. And then 10% of that has to be moonshots, like where we just make guesses about the things that we have very little data on. But if we don't, someone else is going to guess right. And we just need to consistently be putting resources and money and time into thinking about the future and planning and trying things and failing. And you know what I mean? So I think that that's the unfortunate reality, is we have to be doing both, and we have to live in a tension of thinking about the future all the time while dealing with what's right in front of us.
Yeah.
I saw
Thank
Tara
you.
had her hand up.
Yeah, Tara, over to you.
I just love the reactions button. I can't help myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm sorry I hopped on late. Caleb, thanks for the slides and the lead. I'm sorry I missed some of your other points.
No worries.
I was thinking a lot while you were talking about AI and a recent conversation I had with an investor in the Bay Area who told me that their whole portfolio and the way they were looking at ed tech was starting to focus on this like emerging technology where you could put in context for an essay and it'll just spit out the entire essay using natural language
Exactly what you're
processing.
talking
And I
about.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, good. I wasn't there, but I was there in spirit. And I was talking to this investor and I was like, well, do you actually want to invest in this technology? Like all the, nerdy computer programmer high school students might be using it to one up their English teacher, but like what does that mean for you as like a firm and writing a thesis and, involving other people in your due diligence process and like ethics and teaching higher, cognitive skills. And
Yep.
so it was a conversation with him coupled with an ed tech founder who just got into the Denver Workforce Accelerator. And she was using NLP and AI to take student stories that they wrote about themselves and pull out competencies based on their life experiences to give them credit for skills they've learned in their lives to transfer into college credit.
Super interesting.
And I was like, oh my gosh, like that is an amazing application of bringing students' lived experiences into the education system in ways that we couldn't otherwise. So it was like the same technology. Who built it? Different lenses.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know, when I think about like AI and the future of it and shaping it and I don't know, positioning and promoting who I can.
Yeah.
I think about those two contrasts lately.
What a great example of change being inevitable, but it can be good or bad based on the motivations, based on the applications of it. But I think that is going to make a huge difference to how we think about people's just intellectual competency and authority in the next few years. Like if I can be an undergrad and trick my professors into thinking that I am an expert in X, what makes me think I can't also do that to future employers or, to publishers or whoever, like it's kind of scary to think about.
Teaching deception skills, not really my vibe.
Well, I mean, and imagine what's going to have to catch up on the other end in terms of them trying to use the same software to catch that kind of deception. And who's going to get caught in that net and have to be like, already we have AI that's trying to catch people cheating on college essays and people being like, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't cheat on this essay, like what recourse are they going to have to claim they didn't cheat? Like anyway, it's going to get messy.
Yeah, I'd love to hold up one more question that Priyanka put in the chat a few minutes ago to bring it back to a little bit more of the centrality around traditional education and learning, I guess, for K-12 or higher ed specifically. She asks, are there ways that traditional learning techniques like reading and writing could be incorporated into these immersive environments, in your opinion? Just curious on your thoughts there, and what might students lose out on from moving so quickly and into this digital and metaverse space. What are your thoughts on that?
I've got a couple thoughts. I mean, one is that there is a future, again, talking about possible futures, there is a future in which reading and writing actually become deprioritized. A lot of the things that we read and write about now are things that we can't experience, right? Like going back to my Egypt example, we learn about Egypt from a textbook and from pictures, and we write essays about what we learned and et cetera, et cetera. Are we still going to have to do that if we can just throw on our equipment and go visit the pyramids, or throw on our equipment and actually be in some immersive environment like it was in Egypt back in the, you know what I mean? Like there's so many different kinds of ways you could see that going, where education professionals start to think that that is a better educational experience than actually having to write about it. You know what I mean? Or maybe, again, another possible future is they have to do both. Maybe they do something immersive and then they have to reflect on it. I could also see, like, I've got some really interesting tech here. This is my Remarkable. This is like, I love this thing, product placement. I love this thing because it is a great hybrid between writing with a actual pen and paper and an iPad, which I hate writing on. It's like a completely terrible writing experience to me. Like you could have tech like that actually integrated into some immersive experience, especially if you're doing distributed learning, where everyone has their own kind of like, you know, thing that the teacher can monitor, but all of the classroom experience is actually happening locally in your actual house. You know, like there's some interesting hardware and implications there too, but I could see it going a couple of different ways. I think that the bigger question is, does actual writing with a pen and a paper start to go away?
Right, we're already seeing handwriting classes going away.
That's what I'm saying. Yes,
Mhm.
my son right now does all of his homework on his iPad. Speaking of Google Classroom earlier, he rarely actually writes things with his hand anymore.
Mhm. Yeah, all really good thoughts. And we love our Remarkables over here too, in terms of
Nice.
functionality. And yeah, just a lot, you know, so many conversations lately
They
about
should be paying
the
us for this.
hybridity of the whole thing, right? Traditional versus not so traditional. What'd you say,
Yeah.
Caleb, there?
I said Remarkable should be paying us for this. This is
I
like,
know, product placement, little commission here and there. Yeah. Yeah, well, this was wonderful. It was so good to see you all. And as usual, I feel like there's so many more things we could talk about, but within an hour, I think we covered so much. And yeah, please look for the next Inspiration Hour, the first week of December. And I just want to give a shout out to Caleb. Thank you so much for investing in this group and for preparing for today. And as always, you just bring such brilliance and thoughtfulness to the conversation. And also Sarah, thank you so much for all your planning on our Desklight team. She's really the person that brings these together and emails the speakers and gets all of it planned. So amazing job. And as I said, this is always fun to see more and more people coming to these each month. So again, thank you. We do these because we love them. We love to get everybody together in this virtual room. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
thanks, everyone.
Bye.